Hi everyone, so today we're going to make some cola. Now the final product was pretty close to what you might get at the store and what you might be expecting, but I'll let you be the judge. So you guys have probably all had some form of cola before, so I really don't need to introduce it. We can just go straight into the recipe. Now the recipe can be broken down into three main parts. We first have a flavoring, which is called 7X, the cola flavoring. We need to prepare the other components that go into the soda syrup, and then we need to cook all this stuff together to actually make the syrup. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is make the flavoring. And to do this, you can use all essential oils, which is what the original recipe calls for. But since I really didn't want to spend 40 euros on essential oils, I instead tried to make my own 7X flavor compound using the actual ingredients that make up the essential oils. And this was a little bit more work, but I mean, in the end, it worked the same. So we just need the following ingredients to actually make the flavoring. We need 10 grams of an orange peel. We need 10 grams of a lemon peel. We need 4 grams of cinnamon, which is about 1 stick. We need about 1 gram of nutmeg, 1 gram of coriander seeds, and lastly, 4 grams of neroli or bitter orange peel. But I really couldn't find these, so I did some research and found out that kaffir lime leaves are comprised of 80% of the same flavonoid compound, and so I used 4 grams of those instead. And the kind of funny thing you realize when you're making this is actually that cola is really just a citrusy lemon drink with some spices in it. Anyways, that's kind of weird. So now that we have our 7 ingredients that make up the quote-unquote 7X flavoring, we need to actually get the flavors out of these ingredients. And essentially you would do this by having some sort of essential oil, where you have a carrier oil that's holding the flavor compounds that make up these flavors. Now, there's plenty of ways to actually get these flavors out, or these essential oils out. You can use stuff like steam distillation, you can soak them in oil for about a month or so, but I was in a bind for time, so I wanted to attempt a shortcut, which was to pound them in a mortar and pestle, and then put them into a pot with about 75 milliliters or 5 tablespoons of coconut oil. This will act as a carrier oil, and basically we'll heat this up and strain out the coconut oil later, and hopefully all the flavors will come with it. So the next step is to take this pounded mixture and steep these ingredients in oil while heating it over low heat for about 30 minutes. So we just simply need to put this pan on the stove, let it sit for about 30 minutes, and then pull it off. So after the 30 minutes were up, I strained off the coconut oil, and what we're left with is a super fragrant Coke flavored oil that has all of the flavor compounds from the ingredients that were simmering in it. So now we have a slight problem here, which is that the flavors are dissolved within this oil, and we want to use water for the rest of our cola. Now, as you know, water and oil repel each other, so how do we get these two to mix? Well, we can use an emulsifying agent. Now we have two options here. One is, which is the method I'm going to use, is to use alcohol as the emulsifying agent. Now the amount of alcohol we'll use here is so minimal that it'll be virtually non-existent in the final Coke, but if you don't want to emulsify using alcohol, that's completely understandable. You can also use something called gum arabic, which is what's typically used in regular cola. It's apparently pretty easy to find online, just make sure that you get food grade stuff and not stuff made for art. So I'm going to use the alcohol method, and for that I'm using 10 milliliters of alcohol, and I'm going to use the moonshine that I've made in a previous video, because it's a semi-neutral flavor and it's mostly ethanol, which is what we're after. We can then add 3 tablespoons of our flavored oil, and then we need to whisk both the alcohol and oil together until they become very tiny dots, so tiny that you can't see them. It should also be stable and not separate again after a few seconds. Now, once we have our emulsified mixture, we can move on to the next step, which is preparing the rest of our ingredients. So first off, we have our sugar. Now in retrospect, I would recommend about half the sugar here, but I'm not really a fan of the overly sweet colas that you find at the store. But if you are a fan of those kinds of sodas, you can use the originally called for amount, which is 600 grams. If you want it a little bit less sweet, you can add a little bit less. We'll also need another 100 grams to caramelize, and this will help with the color and the flavor. We'll just separate this to the side. Next, we need 3.5 grams of citric acid, and lastly, we need 500 milliliters or about 1 lime's worth of lime juice. Now, the version I'm making will be caffeine free, but if you choose to add some caffeine, it would be good to prepare that right now as well. And lastly, we need 500 milliliters or about 2 cups worth of water. Okay, now that we've gathered all the ingredients, we can actually work on creating the cola syrup. Now here, we want to take those 100 grams that we've separated out for the caramelization, and we're going to simply pour this into a pan over medium-low heat and let the pan heat up. Now be sure to stir the sugar as it starts to melt. As it starts to melt, it will also start to turn brown, and this is exactly what we want. At the point where the sugar has completely melted and we have a nice brown color, we can go ahead and add in our 500 milliliters of water. Once we add the water, it will immediately seize up and crystallize, but don't worry. Just try to stir this mixture up, and eventually the caramel will begin to dissolve in the water again. And once it has, we can go ahead and add in the rest of our sugar. We can then add in the citric acid and lastly the lime juice. Now, I've always heard that Coca Cola without any food coloring would be green, and I didn't really believe it. But after adding the lime juice, the whole syrup that I was making turned green actually, and you can see it here. To give it a little more of a realistic Coke color, I personally will be adding in some black food coloring that I have. But that part is completely optional and up to you. So once everything's mixed, we can pull the syrup off the stove and let it cool down. I let mine cool down for a few hours, at which point it's time to make a soda. You simply need 2 tablespoons of syrup for about 12 ounces or about 330 milliliters of soda water. So you just pour the syrup in, then you pour the water in. But I also recommend to adjust the syrup ratio for your personal taste. Give it a good mix with a spoon and then add a few ice cubes. And that's it. It tasted similar, but not quite the same as a regular Coke. In the future, I definitely will reduce the amount of sugar and play with the flavoring ratios a little bit more to try to make it a little closer to the Coke you'd find in a store. But in my personal opinion, that's where all the fun is. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please be sure to check out some of my other content. And thanks for watching. Bye!